Everything you thought you knew about Hollywood's greatest stars is only half the story. Beneath the fame, behind the flawless images and award-winning roles, lived lives far more complicated and far more disturbing than the public ever saw. These weren't just actors. They were survivors, secrets keepers, and sometimes cautionary tales in motion. The Golden Age sold perfection. What it hid was pain, power plays, scandal, and silence. These are the legends you grew up admiring, but not for the reasons you're about to discover. Prepare to go beyond the spotlight, because once you see what was really happening behind the scenes, there's no going back. Charlie Chaplin, the man who made the world laugh while running from his own. Charlie Chaplin. The bowler hat, the cane, the little mustache, an image etched into global memory. He made the world laugh without saying a word, but what he didn't say off-screen speaks volumes. Chaplin wasn't just a comedian, he was a revolutionary force. He turned silent film into art, satire into poetry, and sorrow into slapstick. But behind the brilliance was a man constantly in motion, running from poverty, from scandal, from governments, and from ghosts he never seemed to shake. Born into hardship in London, he learned early that performance could be survival. But even as his fame exploded across continents, Chaplin's private life stirred unease. He clashed with authority, rejected convention, and lived as if rules didn't apply, because for a while they didn't. He was adored by millions, yet constantly watched. Not just by fans, but by people in power. His views, his choices, and his defiance of political pressure made him a target. In an era of forced smiles and moral scrutiny, Chaplin refused to play along. And when the system pushed back, he didn't blink. He walked away from the country that made him a legend. Chaplin's genius was undeniable, but so was his complexity. He built a legacy that changed cinema forever, while leaving behind questions that history still debates. Was he a hero of the people, or a man too flawed to fully understand? One thing is certain. No matter how far he traveled or how much silence he wrapped himself in, the story of Charlie Chaplin never stopped speaking. Judy Garland, the price of a perfect voice. Judy Garland, the voice of innocence, the face of a dream, the girl who led us down the yellow brick road and never quite found her way back. From her very first screen test, the industry knew she was different. Not just talented, magnetic, but with that magnetism came pressure. From the moment she entered the studio system, her life was no longer her own. Everything, her weight, her image, even her energy, was monitored and controlled. What the world saw was effortless charm. What she lived was relentless demand. At just 16, she became Dorothy, a role that would define her and trap her. While audiences watched her soar over rainbows, she was quietly unraveling beneath the surface. The smile was part of the performance. The rest stayed hidden behind closed doors and long studio nights. They needed her to be perfect, and she tried. Again and again, show after show, film after film. But perfection isn't sustainable, not for anyone. And especially not for someone who never got to grow up outside the spotlight. Her relationships were chaotic, her health unpredictable. But the stage, that was her constant. Even when her voice cracked or her hands trembled, she still walked out under the lights and delivered, because that's what she'd been trained to do. To give everything, even when there was nothing left. Judy Garland wasn't just a star, she was a symbol. Of brilliance under pressure. Of beauty shaped by control. Of someone who gave the world magic while quietly paying the price behind the curtain. She didn't fade. She burned, and we're still seeing the glow. Marlon Brando, the rebel who couldn't escape himself. Marlon Brando. He didn't just act, he detonated. Every word, every pause, every glare on screen was unpredictable, electric. He changed what acting meant. But off-screen, he was just as volatile, not in performance but in life. Brando wasn't interested in fame. He didn't chase it. He resisted it. He mocked it. And yet, it followed him relentlessly. As his reputation grew, so did the myth. The method actor, the heartthrob, the recluse. But beneath all that was a man who never seemed entirely at ease. Not with Hollywood, not with others, not even with himself. He built walls. Around his home, around his family, around his truth. He could be warm, then cold. Devoted, then distant. And while the public admired his refusal to play the Hollywood game, those closest to him often felt the cost of his chaos. Brando spoke out about politics, injustice, identity, long before it was fashionable. He was fearless in his convictions. But while his public stance was bold, his private world was stormy. His household saw more turmoil than most knew. And some of that would erupt into headlines years later, shattering the illusion that brilliance could protect anyone from pain. He once said, "The only reason I'm in Hollywood is that I don't have the moral courage to refuse the money." That wasn't a joke. It was a warning. Marlon Brando left behind performances that still shake audiences to this day. But he also left behind questions about fame, about family, about how far a man can run from himself before even the spotlight can't find him. Joan Crawford, the woman who refused to break. Joan Crawford. She wasn't just a movie star, she was a force. Fierce, poised, and utterly unforgettable. She rose from poverty, remade herself from scratch, and clawed her way into the highest ranks of Hollywood royalty. But behind the sculpted cheekbones and commanding gaze was a life shaped by survival and secrecy. She started with nothing. Not a name, not a future, not a family that protected her. So she built an empire out of grit. Crawford didn't wait for opportunity, she demanded it. Reinvented herself again and again. From flapper girl to dramatic powerhouse, from leading lady to terrifying matriarch. The studio system didn't make her, she bent it to her will. But that kind of control came at a cost. Her relationships were strained. Her children spoke of coldness, discipline, fear. She lived in a world of perfection, polished homes, spotless appearances, and iron discipline, as if chaos was always waiting just outside the door. And when the spotlight faded, she didn't go quietly. Joan fought for relevance, for dignity, for legacy. Even as the roles dried up and the industry moved on, she stayed visible, powerful, even terrifying. Not just to her critics, but sometimes to those closest to her. After her death, her carefully managed image cracked. Accusations surfaced, stories that conflicted with the legend. And suddenly, people weren't sure which Joan Crawford was real, the icon or the shadow behind her. But here's what's undeniable. Joan Crawford endured. Through reinvention, rejection, and relentless pressure, she remained unbreakable. Not soft, not simple, but steel and unforgettable. Ingrid Bergman, the scandal that couldn't silence her. Ingrid Bergman, graceful, luminous, and fiercely intelligent, she was Hollywood's portrait of elegance. The star of Casablanca, the woman who made heartbreak look beautiful. But beneath that serene exterior was someone who didn't follow the rules and paid the price for it. She wasn't a studio puppet. She didn't play the game the way they expected. At the height of her fame, with the world at her feet, Ingrid made a decision that would shatter her image. She left America and left behind the version of herself that had been crafted for public consumption. Her personal life made headlines louder than her films. She was condemned in Congress, blacklisted by the very industry that once praised her. All for choosing a path that didn't fit the mold. For loving boldly. For living on her terms. But Ingrid didn't apologize. She didn't retreat. She worked abroad, built a new career, won awards in foreign languages, and reminded the world what true talent looks like, with or without approval. Years later, Hollywood came back to her. It always does when it realizes what it lost. She returned, accepted standing ovations, and earned yet another Oscar, not just for acting, but for endurance. Ingrid Bergman's life wasn't a fall from grace. It was a rejection of false grace altogether. She didn't ask for permission to be complex. She simply was. And in doing so, she became more than an actress. She became a symbol of quiet defiance and the cost of living your truth in a world built on illusion. Errol Flynn, the hero who lived like a villain. Errol Flynn. He was the swashbuckling daredevil, the dashing rogue with a sword in his hand and a grin on his face. On screen, he was adventure incarnate. Off screen, he was something else entirely. Flynn didn't just play the rebel, he embodied it. He lived fast, talked big, and broke every rule he came across. Hollywood couldn't control him. Directors couldn't tame him. He was charming, wild, unpredictable, and for a time, unstoppable. But behind the charm was a man spiraling. He treated life like a thrill ride with no brakes. Wherever he went, chaos followed. The headlines, the courtrooms, the whispers, they became part of his legend. And while the public kept watching, some started wondering where the role ended and the real man began. His private world was full of contradictions. Glamour and recklessness. Popularity and isolation. He surrounded himself with noise, with parties, with distractions, but even in a crowded room, Errol Flynn often seemed far away, like he knew the lights wouldn't stay on forever. His health declined early. His career faltered. The sparkle in his eye dimmed long before his name faded from marquees. But he kept the performance going, right to the end. Errol Flynn once joked, "I intend to live the first half of my life, "I don't care about the second." He meant it, and he lived it. He may have been a hero in costume, but the man behind the mask was far more haunted than heroic. In the end, Flynn didn't just entertain the world, he warned it. That charm can be a shield, fame a disguise, and not all legends age like the tales they tell. Hedy Lamarr, the beauty who was always underestimated. Hedy Lamarr. She was called the most beautiful woman in the world, a face so striking it could stop time. But for all the adoration she received on screen, what she truly craved was to be seen for what lay beneath the surface. To Hollywood, she was exotic, mysterious, and untouchable. She played queens, temptresses, and dream women, always lit to perfection, always posed just right. But behind the lens was a mind racing with ideas, questions, and inventions no one cared to hear. Hedy wasn't just an actress. She was a visionary, sketching out designs in her trailer between takes, thinking about science while others talked scripts and costumes. During the height of World War II, she co-developed a concept for secure radio communication, the very foundation of what would later become Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. But in that era, the industry wasn't interested in intellect from a woman, especially not one as stunning as her. She offered her invention to the government. They told her to sell war bonds instead. Her personal life was no less turbulent. A string of marriages, betrayals, and battles over her image chipped away at the independence she fought so hard to keep. She wanted control. They gave her contracts. She wanted to be heard. They asked her to smile. As the roles stopped coming, she slipped from the public eye. And only decades later did the world finally begin to understand who Hedy Lamarr really was, not just a screen siren, but a silent genius hiding in plain sight. She once said, "Any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid." Hedy never stood still, and she was never stupid. Her story isn't just about forgotten brilliance. It's about how the world can miss genius when it's too busy staring at beauty. Montgomery Clift, the actor who felt too much. Montgomery Clift. He didn't just perform, he exposed. Every look, every hesitation, every trembling breath on screen felt achingly real. He wasn't acting like the others. He was living it. And maybe that's why it hurts so much. Clift arrived in Hollywood already respected, already different. He didn't chase fame, didn't care for studio parties or polished press. He chose roles with depth, played men in pain, in conflict, because that's what he understood. There was always something wounded behind those eyes, something too fragile for the machinery around him. He was part of a new wave, the method actors, the truth tellers. But Monty wasn't imitating emotion. He was leaking it, raw, honest, unguarded. And while audiences connected instantly, the cost was high. Then came the crash. One night, one curve in the road, and his face, his most bankable feature, was forever changed. Physically, he recovered, but something inside fractured. Friends saw it. Directors saw it. The world did too. After the accident, his performances grew darker, more intense. Films like Judgment at Nuremberg and The Misfits weren't comebacks, they were confessions. There was no pretending anymore. Just a man showing you everything he couldn't say out loud. Clift lived quietly, almost like a ghost in his own industry. He never chased the spotlight, it just kept following him. And in the end, his legacy wasn't about awards or headlines. It was about vulnerability, about the courage to feel deeply in a world that rewards masks. They called him one of the most beautiful men to ever appear on screen. But wasn't his beauty that endured? It was the pain beneath it, the kind we all recognize, but few ever dare to reveal. Clara Bow, the girl who had it and lost everything else. Clara Bow. She didn't just light up the screen, she ignited it. The original It Girl, the symbol of roaring 20s rebellion, and the face of a generation breaking all the rules. But the very thing that made Clara irresistible to audiences is what made her unmanageable to the machine behind the scenes. She was electric, all eyes, all instinct, all emotion. No polish, no filter. Studios couldn't teach what she had, and they couldn't control it either. That wild energy, that natural charisma, made her a star. But Hollywood wanted more than sparkle. It wanted obedience, and Clara didn't fit the mold. She came from nothing. Poverty, chaos, a childhood full of silence and shame. So when fame found her, it wasn't a dream, it was an escape. But even as she rose to become one of the most bankable stars of the silent era, the whispers started. About her personal life, about her background, about her behavior. They didn't understand her, so they judged her. They called her too much, too loud, too real. The arrival of sound and film didn't help. Suddenly, her Brooklyn accent, the same voice that was hers and hers alone, became a liability. She didn't sound like the fantasy they'd built around her. And just like that, the door started to close. By her mid-30s, Clara Bow had vanished from the screen. Not because her talent faded, but because the industry decided she didn't belong in its new version of perfection. She retreated from the world that once adored her, leaving behind a legend few truly understood. But Clara wasn't a cautionary tale, she was a pioneer. She brought emotion to film before it had sound. She lived out loud when the world wanted quiet. And though Hollywood tried to forget her, it never could. She didn't just have it. She defined it, and she paid for it. Bela Lugosi, the man trapped in a role he couldn't escape. Bela Lugosi. He gave us one of the most iconic performances in film history, the original Dracula. With a stare that froze hearts and an accent that echoed through horror for generations, Lugosi became a legend overnight. But what the audience saw as a breakthrough became a lifelong prison. He wasn't just acting. That elegance, that menace, it was real, it was deliberate, and it was unforgettable. But it came with a cost. Lugosi was never allowed to be anything else. He brought sophistication to horror, but Hollywood never let him leave the shadows. A classically trained actor from Hungary, he arrived in America with ambition and skill. He dreamed of great roles, complex characters, not just monsters. But Dracula was too big, too perfect. No matter what else he did, studios only saw fangs and capes. Doors closed. Typecasting took root. And one role became a lifetime sentence. As the industry changed, the offers slowed. The budgets shrank. The respect faded. And while he never stopped working, the parts got smaller, stranger, sadder. At times, he was paid in crumbs or not at all, just to stay in front of a camera. Still, he carried himself with dignity. Even when paired with rubber creatures and fading sets, Lugosi delivered every line with the same commitment he gave to Shakespeare. Because for him, acting wasn't a gimmick. It was everything. But in private, the struggle weighed heavy. He knew what he was capable of, and knew the world had forgotten. The man who once captivated millions ended his life in relative obscurity, haunted not by his character, but by what he never got the chance to become. Bela Lugosi gave horror its voice, its poise, its soul. And in doing so, he lost his own place in spotlight, not because he failed, but because he succeeded too well. Frances Farmer, the star who refused to play along. Frances Farmer. She had the look, the talent, the presence, everything a studio could want. But what she didn't have was the one thing they demanded most, obedience. She spoke her mind, challenged authority, and refused to be molded. And in a town built on control, that made her dangerous. Frances wasn't interested in playing the Hollywood game. She didn't fake charm or chase headlines. What she wanted was to act deeply, honestly, without compromise. But the system wasn't built for that kind of woman. When she pushed back, they pushed harder. Rumors spread. Whispers grew louder. And soon, her rebellion became the story, not her work. The more she resisted, the more the world around her began to close in. What began as defiance was labeled instability. What was confidence became defiance. She found herself isolated, stripped of freedom, her name reduced to cautionary headlines. For years, her life was defined by silence, not her own, but the kind forced on her. She vanished from a screen, locked away from the world that once called her a rising star. The real Frances, the woman, the artist, the voice, disappeared into myth. But she never surrendered. Years later, she returned, quieter, older, changed. The spotlight was smaller now, but she stepped back into it with the same fire that once defied a system. She lived her truth, even if it cost her everything. Frances Farmer wasn't a tragedy. She was a warning of what happens when a woman dares to own her voice in a world desperate to silence it. And though her name was nearly erased, her legacy remains, not as a victim, but as one of the first to say, "I won't be who you tell me to be." Dorothy Dandridge, the spotlight wasn't enough to shield her. Dorothy Dandridge. She was elegance, talent, and charisma wrapped in one unforgettable presence. When she walked on screen, the camera didn't just follow her, it surrendered. She wasn't just part of Hollywood history, she broke through it. But even at the top, she was never truly allowed in. She made headlines as the first black woman nominated for a Best Actress Oscar, a milestone moment that should have opened doors. But for Dorothy, it opened something else entirely, a painful reminder of how high the ceiling still was, even for someone who had already broken through it. She played glamorous, powerful women. But in real life, her roles were limited, not by skill, but by the system. She was either too much or not enough. Too refined to play stereotypes, too controversial to play leads. And every time she stepped forward, the ground beneath her shifted. The industry praised her in public, but rarely hired her. She'd be on magazine covers one week and out of work the next. Her success was never stable, always conditional, always monitored. And while she smiled through it, the toll was heavy. Behind the scenes, she fought battles most never saw, for respect, for roles, for dignity. But the weight of constantly proving herself, the walls she faced that others didn't, eventually closed in. Dorothy Dandridge wasn't just a pioneer. She was a symbol of what happens when talent meets resistance and grace meets barriers. Her career didn't fade because she lost her spark. It faded because the world refused to keep the lights on. She should have had the world. Instead, she spent her life pushing against it. And still, she left behind a legacy powerful enough to echo across generations, not just for what she did, but for what she was never allowed to become. Gene Tierney, the face Hollywood loved, and the pain it never saw. Gene Tierney. She was breathtaking, the kind of beauty that seemed almost unreal. Her image was everywhere, posters, magazines, the silver screen. But behind those perfect features was a life shaped by heartbreak, silence, and a struggle that fame couldn't fix. Hollywood adored her. She starred in classics like Laura and Leave Her to Heaven, her performances cool and composed, always in control. But off-screen, Gene's world was anything but. Her turning point didn't come with a bad role or a failed film. It came with a moment beyond her control, an encounter, a consequence, and a lifelong weight she would carry. It left her shaken, unmoored. And while the public saw only a glowing star, Gene quietly began to disappear beneath the surface. She withdrew from the spotlight more than once. Not because she wanted to leave, but because she had to. Her mind, once her strength, became unpredictable. The smiles grew fewer. The pauses in her career grew longer. She spent time far from cameras, far from scripts, in places meant not for rest, but for recovery. And yet, she came back. Slowly, quietly. She returned not as the flawless image, but as someone who had survived things the public would never fully understand. Hollywood never gave her space to be fragile. So she carved it out herself, with honesty, with dignity, and eventually with peace. She retired early by choice and lived out her years with grace away from the noise. Gene Tierney's story isn't loud. It doesn't end in scandal or spectacle. It ends in silence, the kind that comes after a long storm. She wasn't just the face of a generation. She was a reminder that even in a world built on fantasy, real pain finds a way in. And sometimes the most beautiful performances are the ones we never see. Peter Lorre, the voice of fear and the face that couldn't hide. Peter Lorre. His voice crept into your mind. His eyes followed you long after the screen went dark. He didn't play villains, he haunted them. From M to the Maltese Falcon to Casablanca, Lorre wasn't the star you rooted for. He was the one you couldn't forget. But while audiences saw menace and mystery, Peter Lorre was running from real-life shadows that followed him long before Hollywood called. Born in what was then Austria-Hungary, he came of age in the growing darkness of 1930s Europe. He fled the Nazi regime, leaving behind the continent, his language, and a life already marked by fear. He arrived in Hollywood as a refugee, carrying talent, trauma, and a thick accent that would define him forever. He didn't fit the leading man mold. Too strange, too small, too foreign, but he made it work. He gave American cinema something it had never seen before, the thinking man's villain. Complex, unnerving, human, but being boxed in takes its toll. After M, after Casablanca, after the thrill of recognition wore off, he found himself trapped in a cycle of roles, always the side character, always the threat. Studios wanted his presence, not his depth. Behind that unsettling screen presence was a man worn down by displacement, pressure, and typecasting. He laughed at the roles, sometimes mocked his own performances, but the truth was harder to hide. The career he built never let him grow. Later in life, his health faded. The roles got smaller. His name slipped from posters. But what never faded was his impact. Peter Lorre gave us a new kind of terror, not the loud kind, but the kind that whispers, watches, waits. He didn't need a spotlight to be unforgettable. Just a look. Just a voice. And beneath all of it, a man who never stopped trying to be seen for more than the shadows he played. Veronica Lake, the hair that made her famous, and the fame that took everything else. Veronica Lake. One glance and you knew her. That peek-boo wave, seductive, mysterious, instantly iconic. She wasn't just a star, she was a look, a sensation. But the same image that launched her to fame would soon become a cage she couldn't escape. In the 1940s, she was everywhere. Film noir loved her. Audiences were obsessed. She played icy blondes with hidden fire, always one step ahead, always untouchable. But behind the cool exterior was a young woman completely unprepared for the machine she'd been thrust into. Her rise was meteoric and almost accidental. But Hollywood doesn't wait for its stars to catch up. They told her what to wear, how to speak, how to move. And when they were done with her, they simply moved on. The very thing that made her famous, that famous cascade of hair, became a liability. It was blamed for accidents among factory workers during the war. Studios ordered her to change it. Audiences didn't like what they saw next. And just like that, the magic faded. Her personal life grew more turbulent. Relationships unraveled. Film offers dried up. She tried stage work, television, anything to stay afloat. But the spotlight had moved on, and it wasn't looking back. By the time she was in her 40s, she was working behind a bar under a different name. Customers sometimes recognized her. Most didn't believe it was really her. Veronica Lake lived the kind of Hollywood rise that feels like a dream, and fell with the kind of silence that feels like a warning. She didn't lose her talent. She lost the illusion that talent was enough. She once said, "You could put all the talent I had into your left eye and still not suffer from impaired vision." But that was never true. The world just stopped looking. And when it did, it missed the woman entirely. Barbara Payton, the starlet Hollywood left behind. Barbara Payton. For a brief, blinding moment, she was everywhere. Stunning, bold, and utterly magnetic, she lit up screens and magazine covers with the kind of effortless allure that made Hollywood take notice. But behind that beauty was a storm that never quite cleared, and a system that never offered her way out. She arrived in the spotlight fast. Too fast. Within a year, she was starring opposite James Cagney and making headlines as the next big thing. She had the looks, the confidence, and the camera adored her. But Hollywood's love is rarely unconditional. It demands perfection, silence, and the ability to recover without breaking. Barbara didn't play by those rules. She was fearless, outspoken, and completely herself, which in the studio era was a dangerous thing to be. When her personal life started making more noise than her films, the machine began to turn. Public romances, scandals, and whispers about her lifestyle gave the industry an excuse to pull away. Offers stopped coming. Roles disappeared. And Barbara, once a rising star with the world at her feet, found herself standing outside the very system that had created her, alone and with nowhere to go. She tried to come back, again and again, but the cameras had turned elsewhere, and the same press that once praised her was now documenting her descent. In her final years, Barbara Payton became a cautionary headline, a name people whispered about but rarely understood. They called her tragic. They called her troubled. But what they never asked was what kind of system builds women up so quickly just to discard them when they no longer fit the script. Barbara's fall wasn't a collapse. It was a slow erasure. And by the time the world realized what it had lost, it was too late. She was more than a scandal, more than a cautionary tale. She was proof that sometimes the spotlight burns brightest just before it goes out. The golden age of Hollywood gave us unforgettable images, larger-than-life performances, timeless beauty, and stories that still captivate. But behind the legacy are lives that remind us fame doesn't protect you from pain, and the spotlight doesn't always tell the whole truth. These stars weren't just actors, they were people living through pressure, isolation, and expectations most of us can't imagine. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not just for what they gave the world, but for what it cost them. If this journey moved you, taught you something new, or simply made you look twice at a name you thought you knew, consider subscribing. We have more untold stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth behind the legends coming soon. Thank you for watching and for remembering.